Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of The Spoken Word. I'm your host, Travis, and today we are going to be talking about the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. In our previous episodes, we have identified Amenhotep II as the likely Pharaoh of the Exodus. We said that his predecessor, Thutmose III, was likely the long-reigning Pharaoh that chased Moses out of Egypt when he was about 40 years old. And we've identified none other than Queen Hatshepsut as the daughter of Pharaoh who saved Moses as a baby. But what about the Pharaoh who ordered the killing of babies to begin with? And who was it that enslaved the Israelites? We're going to try answering those questions. This is going to be kind of a long explanation because there's a lot of dates and things that we have to deal with from not just Exodus, but other places in the Bible. So we're going to split this into two parts. It gets a little bit hairy otherwise, and I don't want to fry anybody's brain. So let's start with seeing who this enslaving Pharaoh was early on in the book of Exodus and see maybe if there's any differences between him and the baby killing Pharaoh. So let's read from Exodus chapter 1. In verses 6 through 8, it says that Joseph and all of his brothers and all of that generation eventually died. But the Israelites, the children of Israel, who was previously named Jacob, so these are the descendants of Jacob that are in Egypt. It says that they were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. And then it says, a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. So we have the first mention of a Pharaoh in Exodus. And this king did not know Joseph. He came to power sometime after his death. So what did this Pharaoh do? Well, Exodus goes on and it says that he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further. And when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. They built Pithom and Ramesses as supply cities for Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and in all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. So this guy is the one who enslaved the Israelites. Now, after this kind of summary section where it sums up that they're being oppressed and so forth, we have two other stories that are attached at the end. The first one is in verses 15 through 21, when the, quote, king of Egypt tells two Hebrew midwives to kill baby Hebrew boys as soon as they're born, but they don't do it. The second story is in verse 22, where it says, Pharaoh then commanded all his people, you must throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile, but let every daughter live. So these two stories about the midwives and then subsequently about Pharaoh ordering his people to go and chuck all the babies into the river, those two stories are connected because it says Pharaoh then commanded his people. So as a result of the failure of the first attempt to kill baby boys, the order to throw them into the Nile is given. So those two are connected with a causal link. So it seems that a single Pharaoh perpetrated both of these baby killing attempts. This baby killer is the father of the Pharaoh's daughter that we meet in chapter 2. So the question is, was this Pharaoh, the baby killing father of the so-called daughter of Pharaoh, the same guy that initially enslaved the Israelites? That is a possible way to read the text, which would make determining who this Pharaoh was relatively simple. It would just be whoever Hatshepsut's father was. But that's not necessarily the case. Exodus does not give a whole lot of attention to the succession of pharaohs. For example, in Exodus 2, it doesn't say that a different pharaoh is ruling by the time that Moses had grown up, even though that is likely. If a single pharaoh reigned from the events of Exodus prior to Moses returning to Egypt, he would have had to rule since at least the birth of Moses, because the Israelites couldn't have been enslaved any later than that, all the way up to his fleeing to Midian, which would be 40 years. all the way near to the return of Moses to Egypt, which would be another 40 years. We don't have any Pharaoh in the 18th dynasty who ruled for 80 years. Thutmose III had the longest reign at 54 years. So we really have two possibilities about who the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph was. He's either A, the same as the baby killing father of Pharaoh's daughter, which would make him Thutmose I if Hatshepsut was indeed Pharaoh's daughter. Or he was a Pharaoh who ruled before the baby killer Pharaoh and after the arrival of Joseph in Egypt. It's one of those two possibilities. So in order to address the second scenario where he's someone who ruled before the baby killer, to identify him specifically, we'd really need to know exactly how long the Israelites were enslaved, that we'd calculate backwards that far from 1446 BC, the year of the Exodus, and see who was ruling at that time. That would be relatively simple, right? The issue is that there are some seemingly contradictory texts on exactly how long the Israelites were enslaved. Let's go ahead and review them. And by the way, I have put together a nice little PDF summary of these texts in the show notes if you'd like to have that for a reference. This will get a little bit into the weeds, but I hope that clarifies things. So let's talk about these verses. First, I'm going to start with the witness of Exodus itself, whenever it gives timestamps about their enslavement in Egypt or when they were there and so forth. In Exodus 12:40 through 41, it says this: "The time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that same day, all the Lord's military divisions went out from the land of Egypt." Okay, so the Israelites, literally the children of Israel, that's what the underlying text says. The children of Israel, meaning Jacob's descendants, lived in Egypt for 430 years. This does not give us any mention at all of how long they were actually enslaved. Here's a caveat, though. This rendering is from the Masoretic text that we've talked about before. The Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch say that, quote, "the children of Israel lived in Egypt and Canaan 430 years. So that's a different variant out there. The Dead Sea Scroll fragment 4Q14 agrees with the Masoretic text and lacks the "and Canaan" bit. And that fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls is dated to somewhere around 50 to 25 BC. Technically, the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch may have their roots in older traditions, but who really knows for certain? So we do have these two variants that are running around out there. So this says that the offspring of Jacob were in Egypt or were in Egypt and Canaan combined for 430 years. But it says nothing about the duration of enslavement. Let's move on to another text. This is from Genesis 15:13. The way that this one is translated really matters, so I'm going to read 4 different English translations: the ESV, the New King James, the NIV, and the CSB to illustrate what I mean here. So here's the rendering in the ESV. This is God talking to Abram, predicting this future sojourn in a land that's not theirs and the infliction and all that kind of stuff. So this is what the ESV says. "Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. So the affliction in Egypt is predicted to be 400 years in length, according to this rendering. Let's read the New King James. It says, "Then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. The New King James says the same thing, 400 years of slavery. So at this point, if that's what this is saying, it would be simple to calculate back 1446 BC, subtract off 400 years previously, and you would end up with 1846 BC approximately when they were enslaved. Just see who rules at that time according to Wikipedia, and you'd be done, right? Well, it's not quite that simple. The NIV renders the text like this. It says, "Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there." So that's kind of different, right? It reads like these are two different promises. Promise number 1, Abraham's descendants will eventually end up in a foreign land where they'll be hanging out for about 400 years. And oh, by the way, they will be enslaved and mistreated for an unspecified amount of time. The CSB says, then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain. Your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them and will be enslaved and oppressed. That reads very much like the NIV. You stay in Egypt for 400 years, and sometime in there's a duration of slavery that is unspecified. So, who's right? Were the descendants of Abraham oppressed for 400 years and in Egypt longer than 400 years? Or were they simply in Egypt for 400 years, some of which was spent in oppression? So, like I said, if the NKJV and the ESV are right in stating that they were oppressed for 400 years, then you have oppression starting around 1846 BC, 400 years before the Exodus. That would put us in the 13th dynasty to look for our slave or Pharaoh. If the CSB and the NIV are correct, rendering God's statement that they will be in Egypt for 400 years and that sometime we have slavery in there, then the oppression could have happened anywhere from 1846 to 1526 BC, since the oppression started at least as late as Moses' birth, which would be 80 years before the Exodus in 1446. So our slaver Pharaoh could be anywhere from the 13th dynasty all the way to the early 18th dynasty. So that's quite a mess. But don't worry, there are more complications. When this passage is quoted by Stephen in his address to the Sanhedrin in Acts 7:6, it reads like this. In the ESV, it says, and God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them 400 years. So the ESV is internally consistent with saying that slavery was 400 years in both Genesis and Acts. The NKJV does the same thing. It says, but God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. So it's saying the same thing. The CSB says God spoke in this way. His descendants would be strangers in a foreign country and they would enslave and oppress them for 400 years. Come on, CSB, you just contradicted your own translation of Genesis 15:13, and you're my favorite Bible too, so sad face. The NIV renders this passage as follows. God spoke to him in this way. For 400 years, your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated. So that's internally consistent with its own rendering of Genesis 15:13. So now we have the CSB, the ESV, and the New King James all acting like the period of enslavement is 400 years, according to Stephen. The NIV stands alone in this lineup by saying that the stay in Egypt was 400 years, but the duration of slavery is anybody's guess. So again, who is right? Were they in Egypt for 400 years and enslaved for some unspecified amount of time, or were they enslaved for 400 years and in Egypt in an unspecified amount of time? This one is pretty easy to answer, actually. Exodus 12:40 through 41 says that they were in Egypt 430 years at most. If you say that the enslavement was 400 years, as many of our English translations would make you think by the way they have arranged the text, they must have been enslaved only 30 years after touching Egyptian soil, at most. Here's the problem with that. Joseph was in Egypt from age 17 until his death at age 110. Joseph was somewhere around 40 years old when his dad, Jacob, otherwise known as Israel, and his relatives come to Egypt, making children of Israel living in Egypt truly plural, which would probably be about whenever this 430 years starts. So Joseph lives for another 70 years after those 430 years would have begun. If they were enslaved for 400 years, Joseph himself would have been enslaved for 40 years. Well, that's ridiculous because Exodus 1 says that Joseph and all of his descendants died before the slaver Pharaoh even came to power. So they definitely were not enslaved for 400 years. That's doubly true when we added enough time for Joseph to have been largely forgotten. It's really hard to forget a guy who would have been the active Grand Vizier of Egypt at the time of his supposed enslavement. So how long were they enslaved? Definitely less than 400 years. The NIV is the only one of our four that gets it right in both Acts and Genesis. So sorry if you feel like your favorite translation has lied to you all this time. our translations are not inspired by God. So the duration of the stay in Egypt was somewhere around 400 to 430 years. The duration of slavery, who knows, but it was less than that. Case closed, right? No, 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 no. There's one more headache to be had. Paul the Apostle comes in and seemingly shatters the entire timeline of Genesis, Exodus, and Acts, all to a million pieces. In Galatians 3:16 through 17, he speaks about God's promises to Abraham in relation to when the law of Moses was given at Mount Sinai after the Exodus. He says this, "Now the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. He does not say, and to seeds, as though referring to many, but to one, and to your seed, who is Christ." My point is this. The law, which came 430 years later, does not invalidate a covenant previously established by God and thus cancel the promise. So at first glance, it appears that Paul is saying that the distance from the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 15 to the Mosaic covenant at Mount Sinai was only 430 years. The problem is that if that is true, there's no way you can have 400 years spent in Egypt, much less 400 years of slavery. Joseph was not sold into Egyptian slavery until about 190 years after God made the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 15. That leaves only 210 years to even be in Egypt, not anywhere near 400 or 430. So, which is it? Were there 430 years from the time of arrival in Egypt by Abraham's descendants, presumably Joseph and his brothers, to the Exodus, or were there 430 years from the Abrahamic covenant to the Mosaic covenant given after the Exodus of Sinai? Honestly, I'm not certain what is the correct way to take Paul here. People have come up with some very creative solutions to try and harmonize Paul with the witness of Genesis, Exodus, and Acts. For example, some try to state that the, quote, oppression of Abraham's descendants began when Ishmael mocked Isaac in Genesis 21:29. It reads like this. Isaac grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son mocking, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. This son of Hagar is Ishmael, which would be the half-brother of Isaac. Both of them were Abraham's kids, just by different moms. So, starting the oppression here lets you uncouple the 430 years of Exodus 12 from Jacob's descendants going into Egypt. So this is what's called a short sojourn view, meaning that Israel spends less than 400 to 430 years in Egypt. I think that's innovative, but unlikely. First, this event of Ishmael mocking Isaac happened in Canaan. No matter how you slice up God's foretelling in Genesis 15:13, there is a tie between the land where the descendants of Abraham will end up and where they will be enslaved. The place of both sojourn and oppression are one and the same. Let me read that verse again from Genesis 15:13. They will be foreigners in a land. The Hebrew is singular, not their own. And they will serve them and be afflicted by them, i.e., that land's inhabitants. The affliction and the sojourn had to happen in the same place. Also, Exodus is explicit in saying that the children of Israel were in Egypt or Egypt and Canaan for 430 years. You don't get children of Israel until Jacob's or Israel's descendants. If you start the time clock when Ishmael was mean to Isaac, and then you also want to be faithful to Exodus 12 and have the children of Israel themselves in Egypt for 430 years, you end up with about 600 years of, quote, being foreigners and oppressed rather than the predicted 400. So having Ishmael's mocking of Isaac being the start of the oppression is not compatible with a straightforward reading of Exodus 12. So I don't think this view really holds water. So back to the drawing board. How long were they in Egypt? Genesis, Exodus, and Acts makes it sound like 400 to 430 years, but Paul acts like there were only 430 years from Abraham to Sinai. So how do we solve this? First, let's all take a deep breath. Have a little faith. Give Paul some credit. He was a Pharisee. I guarantee you he could do basic math, and I doubly guarantee you he could get the history of his own people correct. This guy was the self-proclaimed Hebrew of Hebrews that we're talking about here. So that leads me to suspect that we are not understanding him correctly. So, assuming this is our problem and not Paul's problem, let's see what Paul actually said. This is what the Greek translation of Paul says literally. It's going to be a little bit goofy because it is literal, so bear with me. It says this. This now I say, the covenant, having been confirmed beforehand by God, afterward 430 years having come, the law does not annul, so as to nullify the promise. That's straight from Bible Hub if you want to fact check me. Now, let me rearrange this a little bit so it flows better in English. Now I say this. The law does not annul the covenant that God confirmed 430 years beforehand. That would nullify the promise. So here we go. So the law comes 430 years after the confirming of the covenant. He does not say it was 430 years after giving or establishing the covenant like some of our English translations say. That would take our minds to Abraham's day, but Abraham isn't even mentioned here. So our translations are making us draw that connection, but it's not there in the Greek. Instead, it was 430 years after the confirmation of the covenant that the law is given. That does not have to be the time that God spoke it to Abraham. He's really conspicuous here in that he uses this 430-year number, and that only appears in Exodus 12. So he has to be referencing that text. So Paul seems to think that the promise to Abraham was confirmed 430 years before the Exodus, when the children of Israel were in Egypt or when they were in Egypt and Canaan. The word Paul uses for confirm is prokuru. That's Strong's Greek 4300 for any of you keeping score. Pro means before, as in before the law in this case. Kuru means to ratify, to confirm, to make valid, to reaffirm, or to assure. So this is the reaffirmation or enacting of the Abrahamic covenant, not its first pronouncement that Paul has in mind. That would explain why he used the 430-year marker from Exodus 12. And what was the covenant in Genesis 15 anyway that he's referencing here? Well, there are four main truth statements. Truth statement 1, Abraham's descendants would wind up somewhere besides Canaan for 400 years. Statement number 2, they would be enslaved in that place for some of those 400 years. Statement 3, God would deal with the oppressors. And number 4, God would return Abraham's descendants to Canaan and give them the land. So in Paul's mind, perhaps, this promise was confirmed or reaffirmed when the 70 or so people of Jacob's family entered the land where they would be foreigners and get oppressed. So the 430 years that Paul references then start basically at the end of Genesis, when God really started to make good on his promise and ticked off the first item on the promise list, that Abraham's descendants would wind up somewhere besides Canaan for 400 years. Check. Promise reaffirmed. So Paul, with his usual genius, is actually tapping into the significant moment when God reaffirmed the covenant by making it a reality. This is therefore totally non-contradictory with all the other passages. They all harmonize together when we allow for about 430 or so years from the end of Genesis to the Exodus event with an indeterminate amount of slavery therein. So that's my view of these texts as of now. I think it does justice to all of them without having to do a bunch of exegetical gymnastics. I could be wrong, obviously, but I feel pretty comfortable with this. So, back to our Pharaoh. When, after the children of Israel stepped on Egyptian soil and the 400 to 430 years started, did the slaver Pharaoh come to power? How can we know for sure who he was if we don't know exactly when the enslavement began? Well, we can't. But we can make an educated guess and narrow the field. But for now, I'm going to end this conversation because I've been talking long enough. I want to give everybody's brain the break. Like I said earlier, I do have a helpful PDF that's attached in the show notes that lays out everything I said here if you'd like to look at that and chew on it for a little bit. But with that, for now, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this investigation. I will see you in the next episode, but until then, God bless.